full continuous story in the early years of the Cold War, before the world fully understood what it meant to live beneath the constant shadow of ideological rivalry. There existed a peninsula where history would no longer exist in quiet. Korea had been a single land for more than 1,000 years. One language, one culture, one heritage shaped by emperors, invasions, resilience, and ancient pride. Yet by 1950, the destiny of this land had been shattered into opposing halves. To the north, a Soviet-backed regime rose under Kim Il-sung, forged in revolutionary fire and guided by the belief that communism was the future of Asia. To the south, a U.S.-supported government led by Syngman Rhee stood firm on resisting that future, believing democracy, however fragile and imperfect, must be defended. The world had barely recovered from the trauma of the Second World War, and global powers were redrawing the map of influence, convincing themselves that they could shape borders without igniting flames. But Korea was not just a line on a map. It was a wound that would begin bleeding the moment it was cut. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel was never meant to be permanent. It was drawn hurriedly, late at night, by American officers using a National Geographic map as the ink dried on Japan's surrender in 1945. The line was chosen for convenience, not justice, not peace, not unity. But convenience in geopolitics often becomes tragedy for ordinary people. Families found themselves split overnight. Brothers separated from brothers, parents from children. Nobody asked the Korean people what they wanted. The world powers acted as if history were their board game and that they were the only players with hands strong enough to move pieces. The Korean people were told to accept the line, to accept the split, to wait. But history rarely waits. As the Cold War intensified, so did the tension across the 38th parallel. On both sides of the divide, soldiers watched one another with suspicion and resentment. Each government insisted it was the rightful ruler of the entire peninsula. Each side believed reunification was inevitable, and that it would come through force. For months leading up to the summer of 1950, skirmishes and gunfights erupted along the border. Soldiers tested each other's resolve. The line trembled. The world, however, looked elsewhere, toward Europe, toward nuclear developments, toward the memories of World War II that still haunted every conversation among world leaders. Meanwhile, Korea waited in silence, holding its breath before the storm. On the morning of June 25, 1950, the storm arrived. At dawn, North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel with overwhelming speed and force. Soviet-made T-34 tanks led the charge, crushing sandbags and outposts as if they were paper. The South, poorly equipped and still recovering from internal instability, was unprepared for such an assault. Cities fell one after another: Kaesong, then Chuncheon, then Seoul. The capital collapsed within days. The North Korean flag rose above government buildings that had once symbolized hope for independence. The United Nations condemned the invasion. The United States responded with urgency. President Truman, determined to prevent communism from spreading elsewhere in Asia, committed American forces to support the South. War had begun, not merely a civil conflict, but a global struggle fought through local blood. American soldiers arriving in Korea found themselves in terrain unlike anything they had trained for. The heat of summer burned across fields of rice and mountains covered in mist. The enemy was not only the North Korean army, but also the landscape itself. Hills rising like walls, valleys hiding ambushes, monsoon rains turning roads into rivers of mud. The war became a test of endurance, not just strength. The U.S. and South Korean forces fell back to a defensive perimeter around the southeastern port city of Pusan. There, they formed what history would call the Pusan Perimeter, a final barricade, a last line preventing total defeat. The world held its breath once more. If the North pushed beyond Pusan, the Korean peninsula would be lost, and the message would echo across continents, that communism was unstoppable. But the defenders held. Reinforcements arrived. Supplies flowed. Determination hardened. And in September of 1950, an idea arose, bold, risky, and nearly impossible. General Douglas MacArthur, a man whose confidence bordered on myth, proposed a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines, far to the west at Incheon Harbor. The harbor was considered too risky, the tides too unpredictable. But MacArthur believed that history favored the audacious. On September 15, 1950, U.S. Marines waded ashore at Incheon in one of the most brilliantly executed operations in modern warfare. The landing stunned the North Korean forces. Supply lines shattered. Strategy collapsed. Seoul, the city that had fallen so quickly in June, was recaptured. For a brief moment, hope returned. South Korean and American forces pushed northward. The dream of reunification seemed within reach, but dreams born in war are fragile. As the armies approached the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, another storm brewed. This one colder, deeper, and more devastating. China, under Mao Zedong, feared that hostile forces so close to their border would endanger national security. They issued warnings. They were ignored. Then, silently, under cover of snow and night, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers crossed into North Korea. They moved quietly, hidden by the bitterness of winter. And when they struck with overwhelming force, catching U.S. and South Korean troops in one of the most shocking reversals in military history. The winter of 1950 in Korea was not merely cold. It was merciless. Soldiers spoke of their rifles freezing, of frostbite gnawing at fingers and feet. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir became a symbol of endurance and suffering. Surrounded, outnumbered, pushed into retreat, American Marines refused to collapse. They fought their way south in what they called a tactical withdrawal. But history remembers it as a march of impossible resolve. Men carried wounded comrades through blizzards. Bodies stiffened in the snow before they could speak final words. Those who survived carried the memories forever. By early 1951, the war had shifted again. The front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel, close to where everything began. The fighting did not stop, but progress no longer brought victory, only exhaustion. Hills and ridges became battlegrounds repeated endlessly, each gained and lost in cycles of blood. The war had become a stalemate. Negotiations began at Panmunjom, but while diplomats argued at tables, soldiers continued to die in trenches. The world watched, but the world did not act. For ordinary Korean civilians, the war was a nightmare without clear enemy or safety. Villages burned. Cities were reduced to rubble. Families fled across rivers with whatever they could carry. Children learned the sound of artillery before they learned to read. The landscape was scarred not only by bombs, but by memory. Before the war, Korea had been a land of farmers, fishermen, merchants, scholars. During the war, it became a land of refugees. By 1953, both sides understood that total victory was no longer possible. The war had taken too much, cost too much, destroyed too much. On July 27, 1953, after 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed at last. The war did not end with victory. It ended with a line, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, running across the peninsula like a scar, wider and harsher than the one drawn in 1945. Korea remained divided. Families remained separated. The dream of unity did not die, but it was forced into silence. More than 3 million lives were lost. Cities rebuilt themselves from ashes. Soldiers carried the war home within their minds. The Korean War became known in the West as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after it. But for the people of Korea, it was never forgotten. It was the wound that did not close. It was the cold memory that lived in every survivor's breath. The Korean peninsula today remains divided, still shaped by the decisions of foreign powers, still haunted by the war that ended without ending. The soldiers who fought there, American, Korean, Chinese, and others, left behind not glory, but truth. War does not merely redraw borders. It rewrites lives. It leaves echoes that last generations. And somewhere, in the mountains of Korea, the winds still blow across the ridges where men once fought. They whisper the same question that has lingered since 1953. Why must a land with one heart live with two souls? The answer remains unwritten. The war is over, but the story continues. The war's legacy did not live only in the treaties and the borders it left behind. It lived in the memories of those who fought it, those who endured it, and those who watched history unfold without understanding why their world had been chosen for such a burden. To speak of the Korean War is to speak not only of armies and politics, but of human lives caught in the machinery of global ambition. After the armistice, historians and military planners would analyze the war through strategies and campaigns, but the soldiers remembered it differently. They remembered the cold, the hunger, the sudden quiet that came before an artillery barrage, the feeling of marching toward a hill that had already been taken and lost a dozen times before. They remembered names of comrades who had not returned and places that no longer existed. To understand the war, one must return to its early days, when the North Korean offensive seemed unstoppable. South Korean forces and their American allies had retreated so far that only the Pusan perimeter remained. The perimeter was not simply a defensive line. It was the last fragile thread, holding together the hope that the South might survive. General Walton Walker commanded with a resolve born of necessity, declaring that there would be no Dunkirk, no retreat. The defenders dug trenches, reinforced positions, and braced themselves for attack after attack. Supplies arrived through the port, and reinforcements joined them. Some veterans, others young and untested. Many of the American soldiers had enlisted expecting occupation duty in Japan, not a brutal ground war in unfamiliar terrain. Among them was Private Edward Harper, a 20-year-old from Wisconsin who had never seen mountains like those of Korea. He had been told he was fighting to stop the spread of communism, but that phrase meant little to him. What he understood was that the world he knew was far away and that survival depended on the men beside him. One night, during an intense North Korean assault, Harper saw a South Korean soldier he had never met standing firm in a trench, firing until his ammunition ran out and then continuing with his rifle as a club. Harper did not learn the man's name. The next day, the position was held, but the soldier was gone. Harper realized that war was not about ideas. It was about faces, about breath and heartbeat and the simple will to stand when everything screams to run. The tide turned when the Incheon landings unfolded. The landing was more than a military success. It was a surprise that changed the shape of war. The North Korean forces were stretched thin, their supply lines vulnerable. Seoul was recaptured after intense urban combat, and for the moment the South felt victorious. Yet victory came with a price. Streets once filled with vendors and laughter lay in smoke and rubble. Civilians returned to their homes only to find them destroyed. Behind every strategic gain was a memory of loss that would linger long after the guns fell silent. As United Nations forces pushed north, they believed the war might soon end. But as they approached the Yalu River, reality shifted again. The entrance of China into the conflict was a lesson in geopolitics, a reminder that no war exists in isolation. Mao Zedong did not see the conflict as a local one. He saw it as a test of China's strength and legitimacy. The Chinese leadership believed that allowing a US-backed government on their border would endanger the revolution they had just secured, so they acted with speed and secrecy. The Chinese soldiers who crossed into Korea came not only with rifles but with an unshakable sense of purpose. Many had fought through years of revolution and civil war. They were accustomed to hardship, to freezing nights, to hunger. They moved across mountains quietly, using footpaths where vehicles could not follow. When they struck at Chosin Reservoir, they attacked with coordination and overwhelming numbers. The American and United Nations forces were forced into one of the most grueling retreats in military history. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir did not break them, but it changed them. Soldiers marched through snow-stained red, carrying the wounded, refusing to abandon anyone despite the cost. They did not retreat because they were defeated. They retreated because survival itself required movement. After Chosin, the war entered its longest phase. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, and both sides dug in. The fighting became positional, a war of ridges and trenches, of hills that became infamous by name. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, Old Baldy. These were not battles of sweeping movement. They were battles of inches. Soldiers climbed slopes under machine gun fire, gained ground, lost it, gained it again. Rain turned the earth to sludge, and blood mixed with mud until soldiers could not distinguish one from the other. At Heartbreak Ridge, the struggle lasted more than a month. The terrain was unforgiving, steep, exposed, with little cover. Artillery pounded the hills day and night. The soldiers who fought there remembered the screams, the silence between barrages, the moments when courage became simply the act of taking one more step upward. Strategically, the battle had limited value, but psychologically it was immense. It taught both sides that the war had entered a stage where victory meant endurance rather than conquest. The cost was not confined to battlefields. Korean civilians suffered in ways statistics cannot convey. Villages moved and moved again as front lines shifted. Refugees traveled in endless columns, carrying what little they could salvage. Some crossed rivers in winter, knowing the ice might break beneath them. Others hid in mountain forests where hunger was constant. Children learned to recognize aircraft by the shape of their wings. Mothers told stories to mask the sound of artillery so their children might sleep. Yet there were also moments of kindness. American soldiers sharing rations, Korean families giving shelter to those who had none, strangers forming bonds in the chaos of displacement. Humanity endured even in the shadow of war. The negotiations that began in 1951 moved slowly. Delegates argued over seemingly minor details: the location of the demarcation line, the exchange of prisoners, the language of the armistice. Each side hoped to gain advantage not only on the battlefield but at the table. Meanwhile, soldiers continued to fight and die over terrain that negotiators already knew would be surrendered. The war had become, in many ways, a struggle of attitudes, a refusal to concede, even when the cost was immeasurable. Among the soldiers on the front were also men from nations that rarely receive recognition in popular retellings. Troops came from Turkey, Ethiopia, Australia, Canada, Colombia, and many other countries under the United Nations banner. They fought in conditions as harsh as any in modern warfare and left behind stories that deserve to be remembered. Turkish soldiers were noted for their fierce discipline in hand-to-hand combat. Ethiopian troops fought with quiet confidence and a reputation for never leaving their dead behind. These soldiers traveled across the world to defend a land they had never seen before, believing they were protecting the balance of global order. Likewise, the Chinese soldiers who poured into Korea came with their own perspectives. Many were young peasants who had only recently seen peace after decades of civil conflict. They marched into Korea not for conquest but for duty, to defend what they believed was the survival of their revolution. Their struggles were immense. Limited supplies, harsh winter conditions, overwhelming enemy fire. Yet they continued, driven by a belief that history demanded their sacrifice. By 1953, both sides understood that no meaningful victory could be achieved without catastrophic cost. The world was changing once again. The United States was preparing for new priorities. China was consolidating internal power. The Soviet Union was adjusting to the death of Stalin. South Korea sought survival and stability. North Korea, though weakened, remained stubborn and determined. When the armistice was finally signed, the soldiers who heard the news felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Some celebrated. Others sat quietly, staring at the land they had fought to gain and lose. The guns fell silent, but the silence did not bring closure. The war had ended where it began, at the 38th parallel, a line that symbolized not peace, but pause. The war did not unite Korea. It froze its division in place. Families remained separated. Letters could not cross borders. History itself became fractured, with each side telling its own version of the past. South Korea rebuilt slowly. Cities rose from ruins. Generations worked tirelessly to build a nation that could stand on its own. North Korea rebuilt under strict control, shaping society around the ideology of self-reliance and loyalty to leadership. The world changed, economies rose and fell, new wars began and ended, but Korea remained divided. Yet the war did not break the Korean spirit. Tested it. It reshaped it, but it did not destroy it. The Korean War is often remembered by outsiders as a conflict without clear victory. But to the people who lived it, it was something far more profound. It was the moment when Korea's future was suspended between two worlds, when its people endured suffering beyond measure, and when its land bore witness to the cost of ambitions far larger than itself. The scar of the DMZ remains. a silent border guarded by soldiers who face one another across a space where even birds hesitate to land. But beneath that scar lives memory. Memory of unity once real. Memory of families once whole. Memory of a land that still dreams of being one again. The story of the Korean War does not end with the armistice. It continues in every conversation about peace, every reunion of families, every hope for reconciliation. The war shaped the Korean identity not as victim but as survivor, not as divided but as longing. Today, the wind that moves through the mountains of Korea carries the weight of all that came before. It whispers not of loss, but of possibility. The future remains unwritten, and the Korean people, who have endured invasions, occupations, divisions, and war, remain standing. The war is remembered not to reopen wounds, but to understand the cost of forgetting. For history does not merely tell us where we have been. It reminds us of where we must never go again.